Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a program manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates, and I thank you for joining me. We are talking about Marjory Stoneman Douglas, defender of the Everglades. And of course, I'm sitting in front of the Everglades right now. Marjory Stoneman Douglas, defender of the Everglades. And of course, this is a picture of her near the end of her life. Marjory Stoneman Douglas, excuse me, for some reason, let's start again. Marjory Stoneman Douglas was, I'm going to get out of here and start again because I don't think my screen was sharing. When you're doing these things, you just never know what's going to happen. So I'm going to go back here. I apologize. Here I am. And I'm going to share the screen and we're going to start over again. Share. Here we go. You never know what exciting thing I'm going to mess up on. From beginning. Here we go. Marjory's defender of the Everglades. Marjory Stoneman Douglas was born in Minneapolis, on April 7th, 1890, the only child of concert violinist Florence Lillian Trefethen. She was known as Lillian and Frank Bryant Stoneman. And she moved with her parents, Frank and Lillian Stoneman, to Providence, Rhode Island in 1893. And her mother suffered from mental illness throughout her life. And in 1896, she left Frank and took Marjory to live with her parents in Taunton, Massachusetts. And Marjory was only 6, did not see her father again until she was 25 years old. They were estranged because her mother did not want her to be in contact with her father at the time. And she was extremely close to her mother, as well as her grandparents and aunts. And so those were her parents in that picture there. And this is a family picture when her father was still as part of the family. So both sides of the family tree here. As a child, she became a voracious reader and began to write. And in 17, she was awarded a prize for a story published by the Boston Herald. As her mother's mental health deteriorated, Marjory took on more and more duties as a young woman. In fact, she was actually forced to be more like an adult at a very young age. And she began to manage the family finances. And yes, there were grandparents and aunts. And there were some disagreements along the way, but she was willing to take things over and do that. And she left for college in 1908, though she was concerned about her mother's mental state. In 1912, she graduated from Wellesley College in Massachusetts with a bachelor's degree in English. And while in college, she became involved in many different areas, the women's suffrage movement, and she joined the first suffrage club with 6 classmates. During her senior year, her mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Her mother had surgery, but the cancer had metastasized to her spine. And, there was always a back and forth, particularly her senior year, if she should remain in college because of her mother's health. But the family insisted that she stay there and finish her education. And her mother does die shortly thereafter. Here's something interesting. In 1914, she married Kenneth Douglas, who was 30 years older than Marjory, which in itself is not an issue, except that the marriage ended in divorce when she discovered he was a con artist and married to another woman while married to Marjory. She did wait for him for a while. He was an alcoholic, and he spent 6 months of their marriage in prison for forging and theft. And what was interesting, I found out during that time, you were able to draw up a bank draft on someone else's account and find a way to take their money. And he didn't just do that to anyone, even though she had not seen her father in a long time. He did it to her father's account. And at the beginning, I mean, she talks about him, and I think she was in love, but I think she eventually becomes rapidly disillusioned by all the things that he did. And in the fall of 1915, Marjory left New England to be reunited with her father, who she had not seen since her parents' separation. Her father had married Lila Eleanor Shine, and Marjory wrote about her. She became very close to her, and she remained my first and best friend all my life in Florida, but she didn't really think of her as a stepmother, but more as a friend. And when Marjorie goes to South Florida, on the East Coast, today is a very busy, active area. But when she arrived, there were fewer than 5,000 people living in Miami. And it was no more than a glorified railroad terminal. How things have changed. And her father was publisher of the paper that's going to become the following year, the Miami Herald. And before that, her father had some great financial struggles. I mean, her parents did. He was unable to make a lot of money, but things start to turn around for him. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Douglas enlisted in the Naval Reserve and served from April 1917 to May 1918, the first woman in Florida to do so. This is what's interesting. Marjorie's father, Frank, the editor-in-chief of the Miami Herald, had sent her to cover the story of the first woman in the Miami area to list in the armed forces during World War I. And when she got to the recruiting station, no one had enlisted. And she became the person that enlisted. Now, she wasn't a big fan of what she was doing. So she became the woman, basically, that she was signed to write about. So she only stayed in for a little over a year, but there's her enlistment card. You can see that Chief Yeoman when she left a year later. And then after that, she joined the American Red Cross during the war. And, she had been doing some writing for her father's newspaper, obviously, because you can see she was assigned to write about herself, basically. And so she's also assigned, excuse me, to write articles about the accomplishments of the American Red Cross in Europe, which she did so. So she's getting more and more experience as a writer. After she was done with the Red Cross and World War I was over, here's a picture of her here. And that is actually, by the way, from her college yearbook, but it was hard to find pictures of her from different parts of her life. So this wasn't that many years later. She returned to Miami as an assistant editor. And often her editorials concern the consequences of Florida's rapid commercial development. A preview of her later work to protect Florida's natural resources. She was not a fan of the overdevelopment that was occurring. And she also made sure that people knew about her support for women's equality and civil rights, views she held since her college year. During this time, she obtained a divorce from her husband. I mean, he had just done too many things, though she always kept the last name of Douglas. She also had a column in the newspaper of the Miami Herald called The Galley. She always, and she never really liked the title, but that's what it was given. But she always showed it interest in topics related to Florida. In her autobiography, she explained, it was in the column that I started to talk about Florida as a landscape and as geography, to investigate it and to explore it. To me, this was more important than getting tied up with a man. And that's from her autobiography, Voice of the River, on page 127. A book that I'll mention it again, but I would urge you to read, because even though she had help writing it, her voice comes through loud and clear. You can understand what Marjorie stood for quite easily. Douglas resigned from the Miami Herald in 1923 after being diagnosed with nervous exhaustion. She became a freelance writer to support herself, authoring many short stories. Her writings appeared in magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Colliers and The Woman's Home Companion. Most of her stories were about life in South Florida. In 1928, she came in second place for the O. Henry Memorial Prize for Short Stories, which was a very prestigious award. She also taught at the University of Miami from 1925 to 1929 and served on the editorial board of the University of Miami Press. And that is from the webpage Marjory Stoneman Douglas National Women's History Museum. And I tried to line up the pictures as best I could find of her life to be somewhat in the time frame that I'm talking about. And I don't think Marjory would mind that I mentioned that there were like 3 other times that she had, we might call nervous breakdown or emotional breakdown over the years. I threw this in here because it's kind of connects to the Edisons, particularly Mina Edison. And remember, I told you she was a freelance writer for a while. And this is from the wonderful book, The Florida Life of Thomas Edison by Michelle Albion. It's a little sidebar that she has there. And I found it quite interesting. The only mention of her in the book, and it said an interview with Mina. Another reporter at the birthday interview was Marjory Stoneman Douglas, who came to interview Mina Edison. This is 1929, 2 years before Edison's death. So it was on Edison's birthday. It would have been his 82nd birthday. And had come to interview Mina Edison, not her famous husband. Douglas was impressed by Mina's ability to protect Edison from a world whose attention can, in a moment, become a crushing burden, whose favor, like a river in flood, often entirely overwhelms. I mean, Edison at the time was one of the most famous men in the world. This is me talking as an aside from that. And people followed him to Fort Myers, even when it was a remote area. People hungered for things that he would say, and he always gave interviews on his birthday. Now, remember, he's really hard of hearing, has a severe hearing loss, so Mina is often called in to help with this area. Specifically, the long barrage of questions during the interview exhausted and frustrated Edison. After he made a comment about refusing to give young men advice, Mina intervened, saying, "My advice to young women is to find a man as busy as the one I found." Then she steered him away from the reporters. So kind of a little different view from today. And Douglas published her interview in McCall's magazine, which was a popular woman's magazine of the time, and in fact lasted, oh gosh, well up into the 1990s, maybe even into the 2000s and beyond. And she made the case for Mina was a social engineer. Mina liked to call herself a home executive, by the way. Her work for Fort Myers ought to most certainly be recognized as one of the most outstanding civic achievements, since it's an achievement not just in the material improvements of the city, but in the building of a most amazing and creative community spirit. Marjory Stoneman Douglas, Mrs. Thomas Edison, back when they called women by their husband's first name, McCall's magazine, October 1929, if you wanted to see if you could find it. So Marjory was certainly ahead of her time, but if we compare it to today, it might not seem quite the same. But she did recognize what Mina did for Fort Myers. She belonged to roundtables groups that would do civic charitable undertakings in the city, garden clubs, among other things. She certainly, church work, she certainly opened her heart to Fort Myers, as Marjory found. And so this is before Marjory gives up freelance writing articles. In 1926, Marjory and her friends built the cottage which she lived in for the rest of her life. It was on a narrow lot, a short walk from Biscayne Bay, and by today's standards, it would be a very Spartan existence. It was 960-foot timber home, now surrounded by what some people like to call McMansions, ginormous homes, and is described as having an English charm. It's got the roof, and she lived the rest of her life there. And it's in a part of Miami known as Coconut Grove, and it's a very simple home. I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, but it kind of demonstrates what the type of life that Marjory lived and how she lived it in that little home outside in the Miami area. During the 1930s, Marjory was hired to write a pamphlet championing a garden, botanical garden, an argument for the establishment of a tropical botanical garden in South Florida. The success of this pamphlet made her in demand as speakers at garden clubs. And it also led to her serving on the board of Fairchild Garden, which she believed was a great achievement for the area. And Fairchild, I think it's called Fairchild Botanical Garden. It still exists today over on the East Coast. So she became part of those garden clubs. And she also became involved with the Miami Theater, and she wrote some one-act plays, so very brief plays that were very much fashionable and of interest to people at the time. And this is a picture of her by the water. So she was involved in so many different areas. The one thing I will say is that my desire is to leave you wanting a lot more information about her, as I do. In 1916, the Royal Palm State Park on Paradise Key was created as the first protected area in the Everglades. It was a 4,000-acre tract, later became the center of the Everglades National Park. And Marjory was overwhelmed by the beauty and the wildlife nearby Everglades. And she was an early supporter to designate the area as a national park and served on the park's proposed committee. Congress designated it as a national park in 1934, but it took more than a decade to obtain the funding and land rights. And so there's a picture of it right there down here, where you can see a postcard from that area. But it took assigned to them. She was asked in 1942 to do a series of the rivers of America and assigned the Miami River. Douglas was unimpressed, pointed out that it would not be a captivating book because she said it's only about an inch long. And that's what she wrote in her autobiography. Instead, she suggested writing about the Everglades, consisting of 1.5 million acres of wetlands that included a flow of fresh water from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay and 10,000 islands. Early in her research, she asked Florida's hydrologist, "Do you think I could get away with calling it the River of Grass?" And you know the answer to that, because we refer to it as a river of grass today. And of course, you do know that things over the years have been altered. The sheet flow has been changed, canals, redirection, agriculture, so many different areas have affected the Everglades. And of course, originally it was just thought of as a large swamp, which we know how much value it has to Florida and what a unique place that it is. And there's Marjory. Marjory spent 5 years researching what little science existed about that extensive tract of wilderness. She soon understood its importance in the ecology of South Florida. She researched and wrote for 5 years. I mean, and like she's not having a fortune coming in at that time. And that's an early copy of her book. It's published now with some different covers. But after that, those 5 years of research and writing, Marjory published Everglades, River of Grass in 1947. That same year, the Everglades National Park opened. The book sold out its first printing in a month, and the book spurred the public interest in protecting the Everglades against development, which is obviously an ongoing issue with so many things that have changed. You can't quite get it back to the way it was. And here's a quote from Marjory's book. "There are no other Everglades in the world. They have always been one of the unique regions of the earth, remote, never wholly known. Nothing elsewhere is like them. Their vast, glittering openness, wider than the enormous visible round of the horizon, the racing free saltness, and the sweetness of their massive winds under the dazzling blue heights of space. They are unique also in the simplicity, the diversity, the related harmony of the forms of life they enclose. The miracle of light pours over the green and brown expanse of sawgrass and of water shining and slow moving below. The grass and the water, that's the meaning and the central fact of the Everglades of Florida. It is a river of glass. And that's the original cover of the book. It looks quite a bit different today, but you get the idea. It said, here's a quote from Douglas: "To be a friend of the Everglades," Douglas wrote, "is not necessarily to spend time wandering around out there. It's too buggy, too wet, too generally inhospitable for camping or hiking or the other outdoor activities which naturalists in other places can routinely enjoy," which I'm sure, I had the idea that she's probably spent more time in the Everglades than she did, but that does not negate the value of what she's done. And there might be people, that go out there and really enjoy it. Obviously, they do airboat riding. That's another issue. But there's other things that happen there. It's also been an area where things have been released, plants, snakes, animals that it's not their native habitat, and that has also done damage to it. This is the book that probably defines Marjory Stoneman Douglas. But she also wrote 4 novels and several other nonfiction books on regional topics, including Florida bird watching and David Fairchild of Fairchild Gardens and a garden, and a biologist who imagined a botanical park in Miami. He didn't just imagine it, it became a reality. So that was originally part of that series of Rivers of America. And though I think Margie was probably comfortable it didn't make her a multi-millionaire. And she lived that very simple life in that very simple cottage. In fact, just to back up a little bit, I know I'll talk about it at the end, but I will just say that as they built it, she did it over a period of a few years as she had enough money to do it. Over 50% of the Everglades was drained in the first half of the 20th century. So that has done things that perhaps never can quite be undone, for sure. And she continues to fight for the Everglades after the publication of Dirt, the River of Grass. She took up that cause and never let it go. During the 1950s, she criticized the Army Corps of Engineers. They were big on her list of their numerous flood control measures, consisting of a complex system of canals, levees, dams, and pump stations built to provide protection from seasonal flooding to former marshlands now being used for agriculture and real estate development. They led to shrinking water levels that disrupted the natural cycles of rain and evaporation in the wetlands. Before scientists became alarmed about the effects of the natural ecosystems of South Florida, she was already taking up the banner and criticizing officials for destroying wetlands, eliminating sheet flow of the water, and upsetting the natural cycles on which the entire system depends. And that's from a webpage, The Life of Marjory Stoneman Douglas, Friends of the Everglades. And yes, a lot of changes took place over the years. Douglas became involved in the Everglades in the 1920s when she joined the board of the Everglades Tropical National Park Committee, a group led by Ernest F. Coe, and committed to making a national park in the Everglades. Even in the 1960s, the Everglades were in danger of disappearing forever because of mismanagement, real estate, and agricultural development. Encouraged to be involved by environmental leaders, Marjory, at the age of 79, founded Friends of the Everglades to protest the construction of a jet port in Big Cypress portion of the Everglades. I believe that's the state section. And by the way, the Edisons and the Fords went out to Big Cypress to go camping. Keep that in the back of your mind. And we have an Into the Wild exhibit there. Despite the failing vision that left her she was nearly blind. She traveled across Florida speaking out against the jetport, and in 1970, the state decided to build it elsewhere. She focused her efforts on restoring the Everglades after declaring that conservation is now a dead word. You can't conserve what you haven't got. Her criticism was directed at those she considered were doing the most damage to the Everglades. You heard about the Army Corps of Engineers was one, and she accused Big Sugar of polluting Okeechobee by pumping water containing chemicals, human waste, and garbage back into the lake. The lake was the freshwater source for metropolitan Miami area. And I also know she works hard to make sure that parts of Miami where Black citizens had settled that were treated like they were second-class citizens and did not have access to the basic water and sewer needs. She fought for that as well. By the way, Marjory never learned to drive, so she had to depend on other people. She never gets involved with anyone else after that. She was married to her work at that point, and we could analyze it for a long time, but after the marriage to the con man, that was the end of that. Marjory also served as a charter member of the first American Civil Liberties Union chapter organized in the South in the 1950s. So she was quite, that was rather unusual at that time here. She supported the Equal Rights Amendment and spoke to the Florida legislature, urging them to ratify it. And she did get to know quite a few of the politicians in Florida. In the 1980s, she supported the Florida Rural Legal Services, a group that worked to protect migrant farm workers who are from Everglades and who are primarily employed in the sugarcane industry. She wrote to Governor Bob Graham in 1985 to encourage him to assess the conditions that migrant workers endured. Marjory spoke to the Miami-Dade School Board in 1985, saying that Biscayne Nature Center, which had been located in hot dog stands, literally, and hot dog stands, needed a building of its own. The center received a portable building until 1991, when the Florida Department of Education endowed $1.8 million for the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Biscayne Nature Center in Crandon Park. It was established in 1995 when Marjory was 95 years old, and it still exists today. Marjory also co-founded the Friends of the Miami-Dade Public Libraries with her friend Helen Muir and served as its first president. And I think very highly of libraries, so that's something I strongly identify with Marjory. You know, I had heard about Marjory, but I didn't know all the things that she had accomplished. And yes, she did step on some toes, and not everyone always agreed with her. And also, Marjory Stoneman Douglas, I just wanted to read this, just a little bit about this, that the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Wilderness, that's part of the Everglades, makes up about 1.3 million acres of the Everglades National Park. In 1964, the Wilderness Act was created, and that designated 86% of the Everglades was designated the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Wilderness in 1978. And the designated land is the largest subtropical wilderness in the United States. And it is the largest wilderness east of the Rocky Mountains. And it has now has the highest level of protection on it as possible. Within the Everglades, the largest protect stand of sawgrass in North America exists, the largest protected area, and the largest protected mangrove system in Western Hemisphere exists. And also this protected area is home to 21 federally threatened and endangered species. And so people have an ability to explore that area, and it's named after her because she's the one that's really fought for it. And if you go back and read some of her short stories, one time when she had visited the Everglades, she was able to stop somebody from killing egrets. But what happens is when they're gone, they are killed because they used them for plumes and hats back then for women. And she does write a short story about that. And I know that was also something that Mina Edison and I believe Clara Ford were strongly against as well. Marjory received a Wellesley College Alumni Achievement Award in 1977. And in 1993, at the age of 103, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest civilian honors there is. And its citation said, and here I quote, an extraordinary woman who has devoted her life long to protecting the fragile ecosystem of the Everglades and to the cause of equal rights for all Americans. Marjory Stoneman Douglas personifies passionate commitment. Her crusade to preserve and restore the Everglades has enhanced our nation's respect for our precious environment, reminding all of us of the delicate balance. Grateful Americans honor the grandmother of the Glades, and that's in quotes, by following her splendid example and safeguarding America's beauty and splendor for generations to come. Though she never had children, women are frequently identified as mothers or grandmothers, and so that was the title she was given. And she donated her Medal of Freedom to Wellesley College. She had numerous awards. A lot of them she kept in her very simple little house, and you can see here she is receiving her award from the president at the time, who was Bill Clinton. And there she is. Marjory Stoneman Douglas died on May 14th, 1998, at the age of 108. John Rothschild, who assisted with her biography, he is like the secondary writer on that, said that her death was the only thing that could shut her up, and then added that the silence is terrible because she was a voice for what she believed in. Just quickly, a couple of things I wanted to say was that I hope if you haven't read River of Grass, or if you have and it's been a long time, pick it up and read it. Also, we have a book in the museum store that speaks a lot about the Everglades that's we're featuring this month, that I wish you would also pick up and read, and her autobiography. There's a lot of information in there, and there's some on other sites, and you could easily go in depth about her entire life, but she never gave up the fight, and I think she was passionate about what she believed in. And here's her little home today. And I just wanted to briefly tell you a little bit about this because it was her dream home. And I think I told you it was built in sections as she could afford it. Only 960 feet with a thatch roof, English Tudor charm. Some people call it like a Hobbit size home. So in the early 90s, Marjory could no longer afford to keep up the house. So a trust was created, and then the home was turned over to the state with the understanding that they would maintain it while she was living in it and maintain it after she passed. And she had hoped it would be open to the public. So there were some disagreements within the trust about how the money should be spent, but more disagreements within the state. And there is a nearby state park. And at one point, they were utilizing the home for their workers there. And there was a case of beer on the counter. They took out her desk where she did most of her writing. It's been controversial on and off. And next door was the home of her college friends, which was also eventually ends up in the hands of the state. And what the hope is that it could be a place where people could eventually visit her home, having the home next door being like a visitor center. Well, there's a couple of things you have to know about this home, in that Marjorie never drove, so she had no driveway. It's a small, narrow area, and a lot of the neighbors felt strongly, because there's some luxurious homes, and there is not a lot of room for buses or anything to come there. But they were fighting back against it ever being open, though there's people like the famous Florida writer Jack Davis who thinks, that that something needs to be done. Um, I don't know. The last I knew about was in 2022, and the house needed a lot of work. I mean, there was at one point they show a picture of a skeleton of a frog trapped in a window. There were leaks. There were a lot. Well, you can see it looks. This is a 2022 picture, and it looks pretty decrepit here. So the goal is still hopeful. And you could see pictures of her doing entertainment limited basis to started doing, and a digital discussion. You'll join us for that. It's on September 19th, 2023. Bailey has done a lot of research about Lee County hurricanes. She had